Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome back. Okay, let's try that again. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome back to the 2021 Virtual Carnegie International Nuclear Policy Conference. And we apologize for some technical challenges we're having at the moment. Okay, let's try that again. As I said, welcome back to the conference. Before I introduce our next panel, I wanted to just give a quick reminder about the way to ask questions using the conference platform. On the far right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a toggle between stage and event. Event is the general discussion for the entire conference. You'll want to be on the stage tab in order to ask questions that will then be seen by our moderators and by our speakers. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce you to the next panel, which is on the subject of nuclear risk reduction, developing a practical agenda. As relations between the great powers have worsened, increasing amounts of time and energy are being focused on preventing problems from getting worse, rather than actually making positive progress forward. And I couldn't think of a better panel today to discuss and to analyze those issues. So let me introduce this panel's speakers. Firstly, we have Ambassador Malila Lodi, who formerly served as the representative of Pakistan to the United Nations. I'm also pleased to welcome Izumi Nakamitsu, who is currently the United Nations Under-Secretary General and High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. And the third panelist today is Janneke Freeland, who is Deputy Head of Non-Proliferation, Disarmament and Nuclear Affairs at the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Chairing this panel is George Perkovich, whose most important position is being my boss, but is also the Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. George, over to you.
Thanks, James, and thanks everyone for joining wherever you are. It's really my pleasure to be moderating or hosting this discussion. We have three terrific respondents or presenters, and I was saying at the beginning, we kind of range in acquaintanceship. I first met Ambassador Lodi almost 30 years ago in Rawalpindi, and so it's great to be seeing her again. And I've had the pleasure of being in meetings with Izumi Nakamitsu, the High Representative, and that's one reason why we're so glad to have her here today, is that she's a very, very candid and insightful diplomat. And then had the pleasure and honor of working with Janneke Freeland in the CEND process, where she has astutely and wonderfully co-chaired one of the working groups. So it's a real pleasure for me. Let me jump in and ask kind of each of you a beginning question, as it were, and I'll start with you, Izumi. But the question is, risk reduction in a sense is an end goal. And you could say that arms control and disarmament are means to reducing risks. And there are lots of other kinds of risks. There's risk of war, risk of nuclear war, risk of accidents, whether it's accidents with nuclear weapons or otherwise. Terrorist acquisition of nuclear weapons is a risk that people talk about. The collapse of the NPT is a risk. So when each of you think about nuclear risks, I'm curious which ones are foremost in your thinking and how you prioritize them. Okay?
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. The first thing that really comes to my mind, of course, is that the risk of a nuclear weapon actually being used, whether that is intentionally or accidentally or by miscalculation, perhaps, is indeed highest since the darkest days of the Cold War, that is the previous Cold War. And we are indeed very concerned about that prospect. And the reasons are, of course, we all know it, a confluence of factors, the relationship between nuclear armed states, increasingly multipolar nuclear order, regional tensions, definitely, qualitative nuclear arms race, growing role of nuclear weapons in national strategies, and nexus between nuclear weapons and emerging technologies, and also new domains. This is, cyber and outer space, etc. And, against that background, of course, we have the absence of dialogue, decreased transparency, and I can say probably multilateral mechanisms for disarmament talks are paralyzed. And the regime itself, arms control regime, is continuously eroding. So the most immediate risk that we are worried about is a shorter and more pathways to misperception, miscalculation, and possibly also escalation. And of course, other concerns are there, but priority must be to preserve the norm against the use of nuclear weapons. And I hope we will all be able to agree that the best way to eliminate all nuclear risks is to eliminate nuclear weapons themselves. So those are some of the first thoughts that I have when we talk about it, and looking forward to getting into more details.
Great, terrific. Thank you so much. Maliha, do you want to jump in here? And I'm going to, you can say whatever you want, obviously. I'm going to come back at some point to specific, India-Pakistan dynamics, but just jump in. I think you're muted. I don't know if that we control that or if you do.
I've unmuted myself.
Yeah. You're good.
That should work.
Yeah.
So I was saying that, I agree with Izumi that what nuclear risk reduction aims to do. I mean, for a start, what comes to my mind, of course, that it is really, although it has a very important agenda, which is to minimize the risk of the use of nuclear weapons, because that's essentially how I see it. But I also see it, of course, as a placeholder for the real stuff. I mean, I see it both as an interim approach, if you like, to what should really happen in the long term, which is, of course, nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation efforts. But as Izumi pointed out, and you as well, and James started with that, we're looking at an environment, a strategic environment, or a strategic landscape where we have seen reversals rather than progress in arms control, nuclear non-proliferation. So I think what we have to then focus on is how we can reduce nuclear risk, because strategic competition between nuclear weapon states continues. So does acquiring more sophisticated armaments. So all of which sort of makes for a very, very difficult situation. So I think for me, really, nuclear risk reduction also has to do with the kind of vulnerabilities that are being created by emerging technologies, cyber, artificial intelligence, hypersonic glide vehicles, that sort of stuff. Because what these have the potential to do is to change the severity and nature of risks associated with nuclear weapons by creating, as I said before, new vulnerabilities during crisis. So I think the aim really, whether it's done at the global level, and of course, I know, George, you will ask me about South Asia, and I'll be focusing on that later. But I think the aim, of course, is to ensure that in a crisis, first of all, that a crisis is averted, of course, but then, there is a degree of crisis stability in terms of the, non-use of nuclear weapons. So I think this is what I would see. And I also think that risk reduction efforts do, of course, they're aimed at preventing the most dangerous and escalatory behavior in crisis time, as I said. But the measures have to focus both on nuclear forces as well as conventional capabilities and dangerous doctrines, because all of this is, in a way, these are all elements of an environment, of an unstable environment, which can lead to escalation up the nuclear adder, so to speak. So let me end there and hand it back to you, George.
Great. Janneke, please.
Thank you very much. Of course, I can only add to that. I couldn't agree more. The risk of an actual detonation is, of course, the worst. But talking risk reduction, I think the first and biggest worry, apart from an actual detonation, the risk reduction and crisis stability, crisis management are all these major areas that require a lot of attention. What I think is also important to talk about is the trust, the layer that covers that all. Are we doing enough? Do we trust? Do we understand each other enough? Are we making sure that we are understood each other? So I think apart from the risk reduction and the practical measures that we have to take, that we can take, all as steps we need to take to keep moving, there's a lot to be done today on the increasing the trust levels by verification, increasing dialogue, understanding. We have a couple of important milestones that have been achieved. It's not enough. We have to keep moving. So for that, I think there's a number of platforms that we are creating where we stimulate also as non-nuclear weapon states the dialogue that's so needed to improve all these this mutual trust in each other's systems. Also, as a citizen, do I have confidence that all the risks are being reduced enough to feel safe? Is enough being done to analyze and to take away and to eliminate the risks that are there? Thank you.
Great. Thank you all three. I'm struck in a sense because I think in some corners one hears frustration that risk reduction has been highlighted now both in multilateral fora and various initiatives, and there's some disappointment that some express that that's like a poor substitute for arms control and disarmament, and so it's kind of a sign of retreat in a way. And yet when I was listening to all three of you in various ways, you talked about, and I think Malie has kind of laid out a chain, you talk about averting crisis or the need to avert crises. Then if a crisis occurs, how to stabilize it, prevent it from escalating. And then it was mentioned, and if a war happens, how to keep that from escalating to nuclear war. And then the complications of new technologies interacting with nuclear forces. It seems to me all of those things which fit in the risk reduction matrix have to be addressed before you get to arms control and disarmament in a way. So it's hard to think of how to skip over the various risk reduction elements that you were talking about. So I guess my question is, is that kind of right? And then secondly, then how does one address those who feel that risk reduction in a sense is a retreat or it's going backwards? And so I'd just be curious, and we don't have to go in order. If anybody wants to lead, just go ahead and raise your hand and jump in on that.
Yeah, if I could perhaps
please
start. Yeah. So I think, this risk reduction, a perception that risk reduction as a deflection, or you put a poor substitute, that's the word that you used, is both reasonable and also misplaced. And on the one hand, nuclear weapon states, especially those parties to the NPT, have seen nuclear weapon states either partially or entirely fail to implement disarmament commitments, under the Article 6, right? So in recent years and months, I hear a lot of non-nuclear weapon states, and I actually also have been told by some that conditions are not ripe for progress in disarmament or even for implementation of previously agreed commitments. So despite the fact that arms control and disarmament can be major contributors to international security, there are some indeed who argue that disarmament is not possible at the moment. So there is that perception that risk reduction was introduced as a substitute for disarmament discussions. So it's, some people even talk about responsible nuclear weapon state. So all these perceptions, I think, adds to that. Perhaps these two are mutually exclusive actions. What we need to do, what we feel very strongly at the United Nations, is to make sure that these two discussions, one risk reduction and the other one disarmament measures, will be mutually would not be mutually exclusive. In other words, risk reduction discussions will be, if you will, springboard to something that will contribute to Article 6 implementations and nuclear disarmament overall.
And Maliha, go ahead, because it just seems, what you said just seems so clearly reasonable and accurate to me. But Maliha, go ahead. You're muted again, I think.
I keep unmuting and it starts to, no, can you hear me now?
Yes, yeah.
I think it was the host who mutes me and not me.
I think that's right.
So, no, I just wanted to say that I agree with Izumi. I think, but I do think it would be a mistake to see this as a substitute or as a deflection or a digression from the real debate. I think, it's realistic, I think, to focus on what you can focus. There is the urgent and there's the important. Of course, the important is what we all need to get to, which is the goal of nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation measures that actually work. But the urgent is nuclear risk reduction, because we cannot wait until the big powers are able to sort out the differences and until strategic competition somehow fades away. We are looking at arms races that are proceeding apace. We are also looking at, I won't focus on this right now, but in South Asia, the situation is particularly perilous. So nuclear risk reduction measures, both at the global level and at the regional level, make absolute sense, so long as the big powers, the P5, so long as they don't regard this as an excuse or a pretext, and shift in their entire energy and political capital on this. That I think we have to prevent. In a way, we have to be careful that doesn't happen. So long as that doesn't happen, and there's enough pressure, diplomatic pressure, for those states to also keep, the broader global disarmament agenda in mind. But I do think, frankly, we don't have a choice. We do need a practical, as you put it yourself, George, earlier, practical risk reduction measures that countries can sign up to avert the kind of risks that confront us in times of crisis.
Great. Thanks. Janneke, you take this on, but your country is very influential and located centrally in a dynamic with 4 of the 5 NPT nuclear weapon states. So pick up on what Maliha was saying, and you think about risk reduction in the context of kind of NATO-Russia relations especially.
Yeah, of course, I would like to add to that, of course, risk reduction will never legitimize the continued existence of nuclear weapons. It will be a substitute. What I would like to highlight also the very important function that it can have when the experts continue to have the dialogue and the cooperation. It can actually create those very platforms that we need to increase the trust that is needed to make more progress on disarmament. So it's not a chronological matter. It's in fact something that needed to be done to ensure that we keep the progress and we keep this architecture, that the work that's being done by UNIDIR is very important in this as well. And I would like to also thank Nakamitsu for all that work that's being done. Of course, looking at the NATO context, I think very wise words have been said by Minister Soraya this morning already. I can not add much more to that. I think it's the main goal within NATO as well is to make sure that the risk reduction stays very high on the agenda more so that it's get a firm place in the new strategic concept that's being developed the years to come. Yeah, I think that's where we stand now. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Let me, I want to turn to Malia and ask a question, because I think, you know, people at once have exaggerated for 30 years in a way the risks in South Asia between India and Pakistan. I'm setting China a bit to the side now, which is problematic to do, but I'm doing that. And so on the one hand, there was always the talk that South Asia is the nuclear flashpoint and where they're most likely to be nuclear wars. But I think a lot of that was relatively uninformed, and we can say lots of other things about it. And at the same time, there are lots of risks that arise from the dynamics in the region. So, Malia, when you think about risk reduction along the logical change of, you know, kind of any kind of stimulus for conflict all the way up to nuclear use, what do you think, for example, Pakistan could most directly do that would reduce risk, and then also then what you think India could most directly do to reduce risk? And those two may not be the same things.
I think, George, if I can take a little bit of time on in answering this question. First of all, I think unilateral action by Pakistan is simply not realistic. So it would have to be mutual and negotiated between the two countries. And sadly, there is no dialogue at the moment between the two countries. There hasn't been for several years now. Plus, the last time that the two countries actually had a conversation or negotiations on nuclear and conventional CBMs was back in 2012. So what I want to do is to illustrate the fact, you know, in a way, play to what you just said, George. The glass is both half full and half empty. And I think the most recent crisis between Pakistan and India, which was in February 2019, underlines this. It also underlines the continuing risks of escalation and, of course, the need for the two nuclear neighbors to consider practical nuclear risk reduction measures. So very quickly, let me just say that, you know, there was a suicide bombing in occupied Kashmir. Indian warplanes crossed the border. They carried out attacks, Air Force attacks, deep in Pakistani territory. As it turned out, these attacks in a place called Balakot, you know, there was no terror camp there. But Pakistan was obliged to respond, which it did, by sending its Air Force planes across the international border to bomb a military depot, I think it was, in India. Now, the crisis could have escalated. But like previous ones, George, a point that you have made, both countries desisted from further escalation and confined their actions to limited retaliatory strikes. In fact, the crisis was diffused when Pakistan unconditionally handed over the captured pilot of an Indian aircraft, shot down in its airspace. So, you know, what we also saw in this crisis was the lack of any third-party intervention, which has been the case in previous crises. Now, the most important takeaway from this was of heightened risks from the notion and execution of a limited war or a military action under what is called a nuclear overhang. In other words, the danger of conventional attacks being undertaken for limited military or even political objectives below the nuclear threshold, but which can easily spin out of control and then lead to an escalatory cycle. This, of course, didn't happen in the 2019 crisis, but there is no guarantee that it won't in the future, especially as the Balakot crisis showed that the initiating country, in this case India, was willing to take much greater escalatory risks than it has in the past. I think another dimension when we need to keep this in view for its broader application in risk reduction measures was the role of the media in fanning the crisis. Because during the crisis, the Indian media contributed considerably to whipping up a war frenzy and creating the hysteria for an attack on Pakistan. So I think, you know, if I was to step back from that, there is a compelling need for both countries to undertake nuclear risk reduction measures. And I know you will want to know, well, what is it then we can do? Well, for a start, I think the two countries need to resume a dialogue because this then can only be discussed as part of a broader dialogue or peace process, which is not there. And for a start, this has to involve discussions on threat perceptions, force configurations, military capabilities and postures, as well as military doctrines, so that we can have greater transparency, which, of course, will help to reduce nuclear risk. Our colleague from the Netherlands talked about the trust. Well, here we see a complete and utter absence of trust, and that for nuclear neighbors who have unresolved disputes between them. And periodically there is a crisis in the subcontinent. So there is a need, clearly, to look at what could be practical nuclear risk reduction measures. Of course, there are a number of nuclear CBMs that the two countries have negotiated. One of them stays in place, has been there for since decades now, which is both countries in January. It's a non-attack on each other's nuclear facilities. So both countries exchange lists of nuclear facilities with each other. And they've done that even at times of crisis. They've continued to do that. So that shows that, a nuclear CBM can also work. But of course, the fact that there is, frequent crises shows that, you can't leave anything to chance. This has to be, dealt with in a very purposeful and serious way.
That was very helpful in many ways, and I want to let Izumi and Janneke come in on this if they wish, but I just want to add that the kind of process, Malia, that you're talking about that's missing in South Asia is also missing between the US and China's other neighbors with whom it has territorial disputes, let's say. And to some extent, and Janneke should correct this, I mean, it's not clear how much engagement there is with Russia on these issues at a high level. I mean, we had a summit between President Biden and President Putin, but that kind of post-Ukraine kind of interactions about stability and crisis management seems missing. So it strikes me that there's a rich agenda, not just in South Asia for what you've called for, but also in the other two regions that are most likely to produce a conflict that could escalate to nuclear use. So Izumi and Janneke, anything on that? Go ahead, Izumi. Yeah.
Okay, so I think there are actually a variety of issues that you're asking, but let me just respond specifically to South Asia situations. But to begin with, we think that nuclear issues definitely need to be very much looked at now. At the regional level, there will have to be regionally tailored strategies for both risk reduction and, of course, nuclear disarmament. And, India, Pakistan, for example, you could already do, expand information sharing and transparency mechanisms, political and military hotlines, establish habits of engagement, starting with sharings of best practices on nuclear safety and security. And you can also look at India, China, Pakistan, the triangles as well. Especially China, India could explore a possibility of something similar to Reagan-Gorbachev-like statement. So there are already a variety of very practical things that we think could happen. And those measures, however, will require political will. And at the highest level, we very much want those leaders from all these countries at the regional level to commit to moving towards, number one, risk reduction, and then gradually also for nuclear disarmament. So there are things that we believe they can be done.
Great. Thank you. Janneke on this?
Yes, I agree. I think in this continuously changing environment, and as you talk about Russia and NATO, of course, it's clearly there are destabilizing factors in nuclear capabilities that they increase the risk of nuclear use. We have to continuously make sure to eliminate whatever we can, but as long as there are weapons, there will be nuclear risks. we can focus on a lot of practical steps that have been mentioned already also by Izumi, but at the same time, what's also very important is to keep the dialogue going. The P5 dialogue is essential, but also the communication about those dialogues to those other countries that are not in the actual dialogue. A lot of platforms are being created by NPDI, IPNV, Stepping Stones, CE and D, which I think is very important as it includes non-NPT states as well, where we continue to create all kinds of different platforms, dialogues at different levels to ensure that we increase exactly that transparency and enhance the dialogue to understand each other's doctrines, understand each other's, on a deeper level, each other's reasons for changing or increasing capabilities. And that said, I think there's apart from those areas, there's areas that have been quite successful in the past as well, also in very difficult times. We can mention successful initiatives like the Nuclear Security Summit process, the ever continuing global initiative against nuclear terrorism, the GICNT. This has always continued its important work with experts. They always find each other to convene, and that will always help at a deeper level to understand each other's doctrines and motives and capabilities.
You three are all very experienced, and you've been in multilateral, bilateral fora. And I guess one of my questions, it strikes me that for how serious these problems are and the risks are, and in order to get the countries that we're talking about that are most directly involved to really address these challenges and give some reassurance to the rest of the world, doesn't it require at least kind of cabinet level, military chief of staff level, if not head of state level interaction to show the seriousness and then motivate the bureaucracies to actually get off the old talking points and do something? And so I guess my question is, if that's remotely the case, then wouldn't there be value in processes like the NPT and other formal processes if that became a demand? In other words, what usually is a demand is Article 6 or do a conference in the Middle East or something like, as opposed to like, your leaders need to talk to each other and address these issues, and you're not doing it, and there's no excuse why you can't do that. Naive? What's the objection to making that a much more pointed demand?
No objection whatsoever. Yes, no, we have, thank you for that question. I think it is actually quite important. Obviously, last week from the Geneva summit talks, there was a reaffirmation of a famous Reagan-Gorbachev principle. And we really welcome that. That's exactly what we have been advocating for the past couple of years. And that's sort of that's a declaratory measures. So at the highest level, that's sort of a political statement, reaffirming that there is no winner for the nuclear war and therefore it should never be fought is important because it inspires, it gives a signal at the political level. And we also hope that there will be an explicit reaffirmation of the commitment to pursue a world free of nuclear weapons. That has been a shared objective of the international community. And then from there, you can actually look at, military doctrinal posture-related measures. There are a number of actions that you could take. There are communication measures. Again, a huge number of very practical ideas that have emerged. And measures to prevent accidents. Of course, there are also arms control, more sort of politically binding agreements that nuclear weapon states could pursue jointly through a variety of mechanisms. So at the political level, that statement will be quite important, and at least at the two nuclear superpowers level, that has now been done. So let's hope that will be repeated by all other nuclear weapon states and nuclear possessing states as well.
Great. I'm going to move to some of the questions that we've received from our colleagues. Some of them we actually have addressed. So Izumi just addressed a comment that Daryl Kimball made in a question that he had asked about what the pragmatic policy implications are of the statement that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. We have two questions that came in on the issue of conventional military stability, and I would say even below that, because there's the problem of terrorism or whatever, let's say Russia did in Ukraine. Was that a conventional military operation or something else? But changing the territorial status quo or introducing violence in a relationship. How does stabilizing those dynamics and trying to tame conventional competition now, how does that help reduce nuclear risk, and should it be a higher priority? Sorry.
That's all.
Malia, please.
I can, for me, the context obviously is South Asia. And I think, and this has been our long-standing belief that given the conventional asymmetries between the two nuclear neighbors, and then, of course, the emergence of new technologies, which, as I said much earlier, is creating new vulnerabilities, we need to have a more holistic approach to this. I think a way has to be found at the regional level, also at the global level. Global, of course, has different dynamics, but at the regional level, certainly, a strategic approach to practical nuclear risk reduction measures would have to involve dealing with the conventional force dimension as well as the nuclear dimension because of the classical sort of escalatory ladder. And because if there is a complete absence of, or the lack of, let's say, transparency, absence of trust, the room for miscalculation is much higher. And then, of course, the role of the media and the social media, I come back to that. I mean, we're now operating in a completely different environment. And this environment creates, a real and present danger of the kind that we perhaps didn't see. In fact, we didn't see during the Cold War. This is completely different. So new technologies, new vulnerabilities, environment completely different. The politics of this being unleashed by the media, putting pressures on the political leadership to kind of act. And in the absence of having to act, then having to pay a political price. All of this, I think this is tough. This is very tough to address. But I think it'll be incomplete. Our effort would be incomplete and inadequate if we didn't factor all of this in.
Can I pick up on a couple of things that you said? I think that are super important, Malia, and that when you talked about the role of media and the dynamic that produces, it seems to me that ends up being less about conventional arms racing and more about changing territorial status quo, introducing violence. In other words, it's that kind of disruptive act that then produces the frenzy that in the state that's been attacked, as it were, or had its territory encroached upon, it produces a reaction there and then a counter reaction. So that as much as the issue is technology and conventional military power, it's actions like changing territorial status quo, isn't it, that drives us? So we have to, or supporting terrorism or other forms of violence, that's where the trigger is. That has
George,
to be addressed. Yeah,
but George, I mean, very quickly, I think, the lack of communication then becomes fundamental, because it's all very well to say, well, there's been a bomb blast in country A. Well, if country A doesn't even wait to talk to country B and rushes to judgment, that hardly speaks of being a responsible state, much less a responsible nuclear state. So I think there is a need, there are lots of intervening variables here, which we need to factor in. So it's not, it cannot be that black and white, that, attack, reaction has to do something because the media is putting pressure. No, you have to first ascertain and have, incontrovertible evidence before you take, before you resort to any kind of military force. So I think, one of the things that I think Pakistan and India should do, I mean, this is not, I don't speak as an official, I'm not an official, I speak in my private capacity, is a mutual renunciation of any kind of conventional attack on the other under a nuclear overhang. So you kind of think that you can attack because it's below the nuclear threshold and you can get away with it. But the danger is that the other country will also be forced then to take countermeasures. So I would leave it there.
Okay. Janneke, Zumi, anything on this?
Well, yes, well, maybe, thank you very much for that question also. I think Malia also included a lot of very important topics to that. I think one is the destabilizing acts of changing territorial status quo. Of course, in the bigger sense, anything that contributes to mistrust, misunderstanding, only emphasizes the importance of the multilateral fora, of the architecture, of the things that are actually there, that are made to increase the trust or keep at least the dialogue going, even at the most difficult stages, without going into actual individual cases. The new technologies is in fact also very much in the forefront of my country's agenda as well, and I think in most of us, as it should be. It has a very new effect. It is a new dynamics to the old discussions and also to the existing frameworks. It's challenging in many ways. First of all, because new technologies, it's such a basket concept. There's so much included. As soon as you have one conversation, there's already 12 or 14 different dimensions to it, as mentioned. And that's something that we need to tackle right away. Already the semantics, and do we talk about the same things? Do we know each other? Do we find each other? Do we have those fora where we can meet and talk about this? Because of course there is the nuclear context, but does it now not? Is it not the conventional context as well? And do we have to still make that sort of very clear distinction between the two domains? Is that realistic? And does the nuclear architecture actually answer the demands that we have now? The threats? Are there also challenges that, or are there chances that they are created by new technologies in actual defense? It's a very important dialogue that needs to be done politically, diplomatically, but militarily as well. Of course, the weaponization of new technologies is very important. I can inform them in my country, in my parliament, and they're very much onto that. Of course, we need to take this seriously and put a lot of effort in that. We're also increasing staff. We're also making sure to promote a lot of civil society activity on this and create thinking and improve the understanding of this field, which is still very, very broad.
Can I ask, Janneke, I want to stay with you for a second, because Matthew Bunn asked, he points out that Russia's rejected various NATO risk reduction proposals and NATO's rejected various Russian risk reduction proposals. And so he wonders, is there a way to get productive dialogue going in the region? And my question is kind of a process one. Would you assess that it's more likely to improve the dynamic and kind of break that stalemate if heads of state in their kind of bilateral interactions with Russia propose this and urge this, than if NATO as a bloc does it, or is there not kind of a tactical way like that to make a difference? Are we just stuck?
Well, it's an easy and not very easy question. Of course, we need to do everything that we can to improve the dialogue and to keep the dialogue. I cannot speak for NATO here, but rest assured that NATO is very much trying to keep and stay involved on this very matter. And individually as countries as well, my country certainly is always trying to have that dialogue opened as well, next to all the other things that we can do. And we are very clear about that as well. Whilst at those very high political level, we need those messages that we've actually been hearing last week, which is a very, very important process, I think, and of course a step up to more work. we need to make sure that we find those areas and terrains where we need to work together and cooperate. I'm a positivist this year, so I think yes, we need to do all that, and we need to do more, and there will always be a way to find a dialogue somewhere, even in the most harsh times. And we need to make sure from all the corners, from bilaterally, multilaterally, from NATO, but also from civil society. I hope that we do everything that we can to make sure that, well, in fact, we reduce the risks of or nuclear risk that there are.
There's a question that Melinda Migota asks that picks up on what Janneke was just saying about civil society. She says, South Asia is notable for not having robust civil society organizations dedicated to nuclear disarmament. Do you think that the growth of such civil society groups could be an element of nuclear risk reduction? I want to broaden that, and I want to point out that Russia and China entirely lack civil society organizations dedicated to nuclear disarmament. So does Israel, by the way, and so does North Korea. So does France for the most part. So basically, the only places where you really have civil society pushing hard on this are the UK and the US, and then in some other NATO states in terms of nuclear weapon states. So broadening it beyond South Asia, the role of civil society in pushing this, could you address and what those groups could do that would be most effective? Because maybe what they're doing isn't the most effective way in your opinion. Thank you.
I can come in.
Yep.
Because Melinda sort of asked specifically with reference to South Asia, but of course, one has to discuss it in a more broader sense. I think, from my perspective, and I've spent years in the media as well as in diplomacy, to be honest, I think, okay, civil society organizations have a role to play, but more important in today's dynamic and very fast-moving universe is the role of the media and the need to educate people about nuclear risk. Because all too often at crisis times, as I was just explaining, it's sort of ultra-nationalist sort of sentiment gets expressed very quickly, and before you know it, the crisis is sort of getting well, not quite out of control, but it's sort of progressing. So I think we need to think a little more proactively and perhaps creatively in how to involve the media. And now the social media has such enormous, as we all know, such enormous impact. I mean, it takes only a couple of people on the social media to create a certain impression. And sometimes, of course, the role of false and fake news are so dangerous. So, considering there is no regulation, I mean, nobody can regulate falsehood. I mean, I think we've been trying since the universe was created. But as far as the social media is concerned, imagine a situation. I don't think we've ever factored this into our notion of what a crisis can look like if there is false news that is spread on the social media that begins to impact on the way leaders behave. So, the behavior of leaders is so crucial at crisis times. Now, how do we address that as well as? So I think civil society organizations, I perhaps, I don't want to sound skeptical. They've done good work in the UK and in the United States. But I frankly think in my part of the world, the media's impact that's what we need to sort of focus on.
Yeah, Janneke.
Yes, thank you very much. And I agree that there's a very important role to play for the media. At the same time, to add to that, I think social media, it's not done by journalists, which only raises the importance of transparency by the leadership directly to everybody with a device. Actually, everybody should understand, and the trust should be gained from the whole society in the strategies that are being taken. So the need to create understanding and reach out and be transparent is not only towards the peers or other nuclear weapon states, but it's very much also to society in general. because there's not one player or one layer that you can educate and be more informed. It's not. It's very important that everyone is informed.
Go ahead, Azumi. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, it's been all said, but even if there is this, really hot social media remarks being made, even if they are inflaming sort of media reports there, I agree very much with Ambassador Lodi that nuclear weapons will need to be protected from those. And then there, I think there are still quite a lot of things that we could do together. There are different responsibilities between nuclear weapon states, non-nuclear weapon states, but I think we need to focus on all. In other words, we need to do everything simultaneously to protect, and especially those, emerging technologies, cyber, etc. There are discussions now taking place at the United Nations, quite detailed discussions about responsible behavior of states, behavior of governments. There is an emerging, quite detailed guidance, still voluntary, but these are developments of strong norms starting to happen at the multilateral level. I think there are, for example, so what I want to say is that we need to actually have an overview of those different discussions and then look at the linkage between those discussions with nuclear weapon issues. For example, would it be useful, I think so, to have some sort of, politically binding agreements to start with, not legally binding, but start with the politically binding agreements to not to interfere with nuclear command, control, and communications, NC3. And, that can start with nuclear weapon states, but non-nuclear weapon states can also join in that. So, that would contribute to nuclear risk reduction. So I think there are still a number of quite practical and yet hugely important, actions that we could do, discussions that we could pursue. Someone asked about conventional and nuclear. Indeed, entanglement, hugely, big issue. So disentanglement of conventional and nuclear forces is a key issue for risk reduction in nuclear field. There are, again, quite a number of impactful actions that could be taken if we are, for example, to pursue an agreement, and then that would definitely have to be mutual agreements. For example, not to deploy destabilizing weapon types in especially hot areas, and those conventional weapons perhaps include, for example, sea-launched cruise missiles, hypersonic missiles that have a strategic impact. In Russian European territory, agreements not to deploy systems in crisis zones. These are all very practical, pragmatic discussions that could be, undertaken that will have a very important impact on nuclear risk reduction. One thing I also wanted to say is that I think in this discussion also really demonstrates that so far there isn't any common agreement on the definition of risk reduction, nuclear risk reduction. And I think it's important that we pursue that. It will be a collective discussion, but if we have a little bit better common understanding of what we mean by nuclear risk reduction, I think discussions could make further progress.
Thank you. It occurs to me that it's in the NPT process, and Rito Wolleman from Switzerland had asked a question about the NPT review conference, which may happen at some point, and so traditionally, right, going back from 1995, most obviously, there a lot of focus when there is a final document in the steps. So principles and objectives or the action agenda for fulfilling Article 6. And those tend to be detailed. Now, many, if not most of those commitments haven't been fulfilled. And so there tends to be an argument about continuing to push those, whereas some of the states involved say, well, wait a minute, those have become outdated. I guess my question is, would detailing risk reductions that would be both feasible and very important, that may not directly involve nuclear weapons themselves, but the kinds of things we're talking about, does advocating for those in some detail make sense to try to do in the NPT review process, and to add that? Because some will say, no, don't do that. We have the list, just do the list, the nuclear disarmament list. So I'm just be curious for each of your reaction, and Malia, that's more you, not as a representative of Pakistan per se, but as a longtime expert in the UN system. Izumi, any thoughts? I'm not letting Yannick off the hook either, but
Do you want me to start?
Yeah, please, please.
Oh, I wasn't sure. I thought you meant that you would come back to me. It's okay.
Oh, no, Izumi, go ahead and start, and then we'll come back to Malia. Sorry, okay. My bad.
Yeah. No, I think first of all, NPT review conference will take place. I hope that the dates will be set soon. But as someone said, actually, this postponement has provided all of us with extra time to do the work to prepare for a successful outcome. And in my view, and I have stated this in repeated times, in my view, any successful outcome from NPT review conference will have to and should include a package of risk reduction, nuclear risk reduction measures. So I think it will be quite important, as you suggested, to explore what might actually constitute this particular package. And as I said, I think mutual understanding of risks, I think, will be important. And predictability through common understandings on crisis and escalation management, and of course, crisis communication. And I've already talked about declaratory statements and doctrines and postures that reduce the role of nuclear weapons. So, these practical measures such as detargeting and nuclear weapons or removing launch warning status, there are quite a lot of things that we could actually consider, or states parties could consider. And those, we hope, will be parts of the discussions and indeed part of a successful outcome of NPT review conference. And I think most of states parties will agree to that. And indeed, there are quite a lot of work being done as we speak. So let's hope for that.
We are, I think, at the end of our time, and but Malia and Yannick, just any brief last thoughts, and then I'll turn back to James.
No, I would simply say that I don't share Izumi's optimism about the next NPT review conference, given the past sort of unedifying history in recent years. So, but the issues that we have been discussing are so important that perhaps it's time to consider a different process, especially to enable non-NPT countries like mine to also be a player and a participant in shaping that agenda, which is so very important.
Yannick, last thoughts.
Yes, thank you. I actually agree with Izumi that there's a lot of work being done on risk reduction in the running up to the next RevCon, and this will materialize in some form. I'm sure it will be concrete, and hopefully it will definitely provide a great opportunity for weapon states to demonstrate their commitment to show their actions in this field. And hopefully it will also create some concrete actions that then can be applied more broadly than only the NPT states. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank all three of you, and I know you your schedules were not easy, and so I really appreciate your letting us encroach upon them. That was terrific, and we're all lucky to have you as public servants and former public servants who may come back and be public servants. So I want to thank you and turn it back to James Acton.
George, thank you so much. And let me join George in thanking all the panelists for such a rich and stimulating discussion. In half an hour at 12 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time, we'll be having our third session of the day with Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov. So we very much hope that you'll join us for that. If you're watching me currently on the YouTube live stream and you want to be able to interact with other participants and be able to pose questions to panelists, you can still register for this conference at the Carnegie website. Otherwise, let me just thank you for your attention and say I hope to see you back here in half an hour.